probably the most important thing a passive investor should be thinking about is, the due diligence on the sponsor. Can the sponsor actually pull off the business plan, right? It's one thing to put a pretty pitch deck together, a business plan with all the pretty pictures and all the projections and all that stuff, but can the sponsor actually execute on that plan? That's easier said than done. Do they have experience in the particular asset class? I mean, they can be, somebody who's been doing multifamily for the past 20 years, so they're a pro at that, but this might be a mobile home park investment. It might be a self-storage investment. It might be single family homes, which is completely different. So do they have experience in that asset class, or is there somebody on their team? Because they don't actually have to have that. I mean, we're all entrepreneurs, so you can definitely bring somebody into the sponsor team that has that expertise, but somebody on the team has to be really dialed in and have that experience on the particular asset class.
So when it comes to passive investing, I think this is an area that seems obvious, but many times the passive investor's busy. The reason they're considering investing this way is so they don't have to do the work, and they almost abdicate responsibility by handing their money to someone. And what you're saying is you better make sure it's the right person.
Right. And I think to your point, Robert, and you teach this all the time, is like a lot of passive investors just want to look at the deal right away. Like, does the deal work? Where, wow, look at the amazing building, and wow, look at the returns, and look at this and look at that. And they don't step back and think about, as you teach us, the deal itself is probably the least important. That's the one that you could substitute the most. What if something happens to them? What if they get hit by a bus?
Right.
Like, that's a good question to ask. Like, what happens if you die, Mr. or Mrs. Sponsor?
Right. Who else is on your team, and who has the chops to step in? In the real world, sounds great. But now, from a practical point of view, I've been shown a deal by a sponsor. And by the way, the sponsor is the person who's putting it all together. Sometimes we call that person the promoter, or the syndicator, or the GP, the general partner, sometimes deal sponsor, right? There's a lot of terminology, but it's basically who's running the ship. What about vetting the team? What are the things people really need to pay attention to?
When it comes to vetting the team, that usually happens on the front end too, Robert, right? So generally you have some kind of a pre-existing substantive relationship, right, with the sponsor. And the whole point of that exchange of information is for you to get to know the sponsor. Part of it is for you to get to know the sponsor, part is for the sponsor to get to know you.
Yep.
But that's one of the opportunities that you have to ask all these questions to the sponsor and make sure that you guys are aligned. Because number one, what asset class and why they believe in the asset class, and does that match what you want? What market are they in and why they like that market? Those are great questions. But then even, do their values match up? Like, what are they trying to accomplish? Are they going for equity? Are they going for cash flow? Are they going for appreciation? Are they going for tax benefits? Like, what are they focused on? And does that line up with what you're looking for? Because again, being aligned with the sponsor is probably just as important, or the next level down after you've been comfortable with the sponsor itself. But that's some of the stuff you want to be asking about. The only job you have is all the work that we're discussing now on the front end, which is vetting the team and doing all that stuff on the front end. That's the work you have to do. And the nice thing about it, though, is you do get economies of scale, because once you've done the work once and vetting the sponsor team, then obviously if they have another deal, you don't have to go through that vetting the sponsor team again. You've already done that work. Now you just have to focus more on whether the investment itself matches your own personal investment philosophy. As a passive investor, you're busy, right? You're a busy professional. That's the whole reason you've decided to be a passive investor. So is it realistic for you to hop on a plane and go do due diligence on a particular property? Probably not. But I think the best maybe quote, for lack of a better word, is the trust but verify. There's a requirement to disclose all the material facts, and they should be accurate. But again, your job as a passive investor is to trust but verify. So, again, you're probably not going to hop on a plane, but do a little Googling around and maybe even if, there's nothing wrong with you asking for the contact information of the property manager. Maybe you call a couple of property managers and find out, hey, what are the current rents in the marketplace? Or, which is another reason why it's nice to once you find a good sponsor team and you're comfortable with them, that's one of the reasons people stay with them, because they don't have to do as much due diligence the next time around, and they can leverage that time that they spent, all those hours of due diligence they spent at the beginning.
Let's talk about some of the basics from the passive side. So you mentioned accreditation. There are some investments that are limited to accredited investors, and there's other investments that are open to non-accredited investors. And then you also mentioned the relationship part. So just kind of cover the basics there. No passive investor left behind.
Yeah, so let's even step back further, I guess, and let's discuss what is a accredited investor and who isn't an accredited. So as it stands right now, and the reason I say that is there's a lot of changes coming around, but as it stands right now, an accredited investor is someone who earns $200,000 a year for the past 2 years, with a reasonable expectation of earning that or more this year. Or on the net worth side, they have $1 million in net worth excluding their primary residence. And this is because back in the day, everybody in California was an accredited investor due to their equity in their home.
Well, this is the assumption. The reason that there is accreditation as a requirement is the basic premise is, hey, if you've accumulated this kind of money or you earn this kind of money, then you're smart enough to make your own decisions. If you aren't that wealthy, well, then you're going to need help making those decisions or limited from it. Now, we're recording this in the first half of 2022, and if you're listening at another time, just be aware that right now there is talk about changing these numbers.
So the first thing that happened is that they actually have already expanded, on the one hand, expanded the definition because the SEC's finally come around to acquiescing to the fact that maybe some other form of test should be done other than financial. So now there's going to be, it's not here yet, but it's going to be some form of a certification program where somebody can go through a course, take an exam, and get certified as an accredited investor, whether they have the financial means or not. But at the same time, there's also some rumblings that the SEC is looking at expanding the net worth requirement from $1 million to, as I've heard, as high as $10 million. We expect to have something from the SEC in the April-May timeframe, at least a proposed rule. But it makes sense because there is going to be an alternate path to accreditation. So, maybe if they increase it to 3 million or 5 million, there's a lot of people who are accredited today that are not going to be accredited tomorrow, but they do have that avenue to go get the certification, take the test, and become accredited that way. So it kind of does make sense.
I think the point here is you need to know, as a passive investor, your status. The sponsor needs to know. Before that happens, you need to know. We meet people all the time that are right on the edge. You need to know what the sponsor is going to ask. So how does a sponsor vet a passive investor in this regard?
Great question, and it really depends on the exemption that they're relying on. So there are some exemptions that not only require that you limit your investors to accredited investors, but also require that you take what's called reasonable steps to verify that they are accredited. That usually means looking at their tax forms, looking at their W-2s or 1099s or bank statements or things like that. And then the other way, depending on if you're not doing requiring the verification, the other one the sponsor can actually reasonably rely on your representation, which is another reason these other exemptions are popular. So you will be presented with a questionnaire, you'll check the box and say, yes, I'm accredited, no, I'm accredited. That way the sponsor can at the very least keep track of how many accrediteds do I have in the deal and how many non-accrediteds in the deal, because even when they have non-accrediteds, they are limited to the amount of non-accrediteds they can take. So it's very, very important for the sponsor to keep track of that.
From a paperwork point of view, you get a big old stack of documents, and let's talk about what those documents are, what disclosures need to be made, and how I can make sure that the sponsor is providing everything they need to me as a passive investor.
Yeah, so typically when you're passively investing, you're going to see probably 5 different types of documents, which is why it ends up being over 100 pages. But the most important one is what we call the private placement memorandum. This is the PPM, which you may have heard of. And the PPM is simply a document where all of the disclosures get put into. So all the risks involved in the deal, all the ways you could lose your money. It's a kind of a scary document, but that's the requirement most of the time for the sponsor to disclose all that information about the deal, the risks of the deal, and then also the information about the sponsor themselves. If they've had any skeletons in their closet, they're required to disclose all of that stuff.
An attorney has prepared these documents, but it's not your attorney. So how important is it that, one, I read all 100 plus pages, and 2, do I need counsel? Do I need an attorney to review on my side? What about my tax professional? Talk about that side of it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, a lot of passive investors are definitely hesitant to spend a little bit of money on the front end to have a professional, an attorney review these, but it just goes back to that old adage that an ounce of prevention is just the great way to go, because if things go south in the future and you realize 5 years from now that the operating agreement wasn't properly drafted or this issue, or that you thought you were getting this, but it turned out you were getting something else, this is the time to do it.
Now, in addition to accreditation, Mauricio, I've heard people talk about a couple of things like sophistication. I only take sophisticated investors. And then there's this whole thing about having a substantive relationship. Talk about those two parts, because this is really interesting, especially in the light of the definition of accreditation possibly changing.
A sophisticated investor is simply an investor that has sufficient knowledge and expertise in business and financial matters that they can properly evaluate the risks and the benefits of the investment.
Yeah.
And so you're always looking for sophisticated investors, whether they're accredited or not. Now, the law assumes that if you're accredited, that you're also sophisticated. So
Which we know in the real world is probably not.
we know that's in the real.
Yeah.
But when they are non-accredited, then it's the sponsor's responsibility is to ensure that they are a sophisticated investor. And the way they do that is by obviously communicating with them. And one of the requirements, that kind of fosters into the next question, one of the requirements that the sponsor must have, or relationship they must have, is a pre-existing substantive relationship with the past investor. And having a substantive relationship basically means going back and forth with the sponsor to determine, are they sophisticated? Is this investment suitable for them? So they're just asking a lot of questions, sending them questionnaires, having them, incentivizing them to ask questions, and just fostering that communication so that you really understand after a week, a month, a year, that this investor, yes, they're sophisticated enough, they understand the risks and the merits of the deal, and we can accept them now because it's a suitable investment for them.
Well, what about this situation, Mauricio? You've got your money and it's working with a sponsor, you're the passive investor, and now every year you need to take all the information on income, expenses, depreciation, and have your tax professional prepare that. What's that process like, and what do people need to be thinking about?
Yeah, and I'll give you my disclaimer that I'm not a tax professional, but check with your own tax professional. But generally speaking, a sponsor will issue all of the passive investors what we call a K-1.
Yep.
And a K-1 is a tax document that's prepared by the CPA of the sponsor. They'll prepare the tax forms, and then they'll prepare 10, 20, 50, 100 K-1s, one for each investor, and they'll send that to you. And that K-1 will indicate the profits, the loss, the sort of the net operating income, and what percentage you own of the deal, and therefore what percentage of that profit or loss is being allocated to you.
Yeah.
But that number that gets translated into your personal tax return, and that K-1 is sort of that proof of that information.
I know you have clients who are investing outside of the U.S., but they use U.S. entities and U.S. tax forms and all that kind of stuff. So it feels like a U.S. investment, even though the property might be in another jurisdiction. But sometimes when you invest offshore, you're not going to see K-1s and U.S. tax forms and those kinds of things. So any advice there?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a passive investor investing in a different country with a non-U.S., then you definitely want to make sure you have some kind of representative in that country, because as you mentioned, Robert, every country has different securities laws. Some of the countries, like Canada, for example, have very robust securities laws, but then there are other countries that basically don't even know what securities laws are.
Yeah.
But that's why it's important for you to reach out to somebody in that country.
Any other ideas that are necessary that you want to share with potentially passive investors?
I think the last thing, which kind of goes into that idea of reviewing the documents, ideally with some attorneys, just making sure the documents all match, right? So there's something that they've told you orally in a conversation, then there's something that's in the pitch deck, and they're representing things there, and then there's the PPM, the private place memorandum, but there's also the operating agreement, and if a lot of times I've seen the PPM doesn't match the operating agreement. They may tell you, hey, you're getting a 7 or 8% preferred return, but that's nowhere to be found in the operating agreement. And ultimately, the operating agreement is what actually governs. And so it's really important for you to be just paying attention, whether it's you or somebody else reviewing it on your behalf, to make sure those things match, because ultimately it's the operating agreement that's going to count if there's ever some kind of a dispute.
Mauricio's prepared a cool report on the top 10 questions to ask a deal sponsor. What's in the report?
There's actually 10 questions you should ask a deal sponsor.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
Just a little help for you to, when you're having that conversation with the sponsor and you're trying to figure out whether this is a good match, you can have this little checklist of these questions that you kind of as a guide for you to ask the questions, and hopefully that'll help you guys out.
If you're interested in that, send an email to dealsponsor@realestateguysradio.com, dealsponsor@realestateguysradio.com, and we'll get you that report. Mauricio, it's always good to catch up. Thanks for sharing with us today.
Thanks for having me.